trouble and a challenge from outside, they close ranks. They even did that with Jacob Zuma. Even at a time when we would have imagined that politically he was at his weakest, when the motion came, even by a secret ballot, he still survived. Yes, there were some ANC MPs that either abstained or voted against, but the reality is the majority of them did not. And looking at the ATM, with only 2 members in a 400-seat parliament, there's really not much impact you would expect from that.
I mean, you'll have seen all the commentary. There's deep cynicism about the motives of the ATM here and whether it really is functioning as an independent political party. Of course, it's important to mention the party denies all of that suspicion.
No, it doesn't help that actually one of the key people who was instrumental in the formation of the ATM actually made allegations to say that ANC leaders actually accusing former President Zuma and Magashule of being party to the formation of the ATM. But we also know that the ATM is linked to the Bantu Church of Christ, which was the leader of which is very close to President Zuma. But also, if you look at some of the issues they're raising as being the reasons why they're saying President Ramaphosa must step down, among them, top of their list is actually the issue of the CR17 funding campaign, which has actually become a major which has actually become an albatross, I would say, around President Ramaphosa's neck, because everyone who's against him in the ANC is using that as an excuse to say that it is something that shows that President Ramaphosa is not as clean as he would have projected himself coming into power.
Zinda Ngobo, as I understand it, the legal case would revolve around the phrase, I think, as a toxic atmosphere, in other words,
Yes.
or a toxic environment. In other words, the ATM would have to prove to a judge and bring evidence. They couldn't just say it. They would
Yes.
actually have to bring evidence that this is a toxic environment. From what I've seen, that hasn't been done yet. I mean, the case will only be heard in February.
Certainly, and I think, when you listen to the arguments that are being made, it's the issue of whether there's a climate of intimidation or fear when it comes to the secret ballot. But then, interestingly, you hear from the former Scopa chairperson, Themba Gordhi, who has actually criticized then, the National Assembly Speaker's decision to decline the secret ballots, saying that, when the processes to elect the president are secret, why is it that the same process cannot be secret? We know then that the National Assembly Speaker has said then that Parliament is a people's assembly in essence, and the work that they do needs to be transparent. But I mean, if you do go back to that motion of no confidence against former President Jacob Zuma, that motion was granted to have it via secret ballots. I think about 30 ANC MPs then actually broke rank at the time. So there are questions around why would you allow it then and not now? What proof would have been presented in 2017 of a climate of fear and intimidation versus now?
There's so many different aspects to all the politics of it. We need to talk about what's going to happen at 8 o'clock tonight, and I'll start with you. I mean, there's all sorts of scare stories. WhatsApp groups are going nuts. I mean, it's that kind of day. 8 o'clock we'll know. I don't see any serious evidence of a plan to have a national sort of lockdown or a national restriction in any way.
Not a national lockdown, but certainly tightening of restrictions, particularly in areas that are considered hotspots. Now, it will also be important to have the president outline what determines or what qualifies as a hotspot. Yes, it would be the daily infection rates, but it seems as though that the management of the infection rates and the capacity of the state to manage the increase in infections will be left to provinces, in particular the metropolitans, as well as the district municipalities. Nelson Mandela Bay, we've seen Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize visiting that region. He's going to be in Knysna and the Garden Route tomorrow to actually assess the situation there. But of course, we know the coronavirus moves when people move. We're heading into the festive season. This is the time where there's going to be lots of movement. And this is why then the tourism industry has already spoken out about if the restrictions are tightened, they would be severely impacted during this time. KwaZulu-Natal has indicated that major events will not be allowed during this period. We know that it's actually one of the tourism hotspots. So we need to hear from the president then, if you are going to leave this to the management of the provinces, is there enough capacity in those provinces? I mean, for an example, in Gauteng, the Premier was speaking about a support and intervention team that will be given to the new health MEC to bolster the efforts to prevent and avert the second wave. Gauteng is a province where there's a lot of movement in and out of the province. Many people will be going to their respective home provinces. So during this time, what are the measures that are going to be put in place, and what are they, projecting the situation will be like come January?
I suppose no one knows. Spoo, I mean, it comes back to this, doesn't it? A pandemic like this is a governance nightmare. I mean, if we talk through some of the politics of it, if the national government were to try and impose restrictions in the Western Cape, you know and I know Alan Winde will be off to court. If you leave it to Nelson Mandela Bay, which is frankly, I think, past verging on dysfunctional, an acting mayor for over a year, no chance of any kind of election there soon. I mean, this is a difficult one to manage, and it always has been.
It always comes back to that, because I think we're at a time now, Stephen, where the country can ill afford to have another hard lockdown. And by all accounts, even though we're seeing rising infections, in fact, at the last announcement by the president, while he was mentioning the fact that infections are rising, he was at the same time announcing loosening up some of the restrictions. So it's a very difficult position that he finds himself in. And the same thing pertains as it comes to this current period. Because now, particularly in the Eastern Cape, where there are rising infections, there's a clamor from traditional leaders that the initiation seasons should open up. And from what we understand, they're going to have to relent in that and have to introduce some restrictions. So you can see the catch-22 that he finds himself in. So perhaps it makes sense, as Ziyanda was saying, that those restrictions will probably more district-bound as opposed to a hard lockdown, so to speak.
And I mean, again, the constituencies are a bit more organized. I mean, also what happened to the taxi industry. It went on strike, got what it wanted. So traditional leaders are getting what they want by the looks of it. The restaurant, the liquor industries, all of them have lawyered up. They know what they're doing. That makes it harder to impose anything. It can
be an easy one, Stephen. But I think more importantly, I mean, if you look at actually some of these, I think also the attitude is changing from the very towns and municipalities themselves. Look at what George has done. Without being told, they've imposed their own restriction, closing public areas like swimming pools and community halls. That was of their own doing. It's actually interesting that a DA municipality would do that, which its leader, Helen Zille, at some point was advocating for herd immunity that open up and follow the route of Sweden. And we now know that Sweden wasn't right after all, because they have actually had one of the worst outbreaks that we're seeing in Europe. So, and also if you look at Nelson Mandela Bay, as dysfunctional as it is, you have its acting mayor saying, please close down the beaches and close down alcohol selling restaurants and businesses. So the reality is people are feeling it at the localized level. So I think the president there will have to go with what the Command Council is saying. But I do know that in the Eastern Cape, particularly, they've had to relent because the Eastern Cape government national government rather, still wanted them to keep the initiation schools closed. But hey, it's very difficult to keep any industry closed if you're opening up everything else.
Indeed. Zena, very quickly, I mean, we've got all of this going on around the president. So he gets his motion just basically removed from the agenda for today. And of course, there's nothing quite as presidential as an address to the nation tonight. What's happening this weekend? I'm trying to remember. There's an NEC meeting around Eastmakashule.
Most certainly, and you know, there's a lot happening for the president, might I add, and you know, the NEC meeting this weekend, one can safely anticipate the issue of stepping aside will be topping the agenda. Really, we know that they sought legal counsel around this particular matter to say at what stage then should somebody step aside. And I mean, one of the examples that comes to mind, because I was doing it yesterday, is the issue of Dr. Bandile Masuku. Then what would happen if he is absolved of any wrongdoing now that there's someone who's actually replaced him? He's essentially been fired from his job. I think there are many issues that need to be discussed. Of course, the date for the NGC also needs to be deliberated on. And really then, will the Secretary General be forced to step aside, or will the legal advice actually say he should stay?
Oh, so much coming up in the next little while. I doubt either of you are going to get much sleep. Ziyanda Ngcobo, thanks very much indeed. Spoo and Gawa, I do appreciate it.